At 2:30 in the morning on May 14, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson uttered two final words to his father before his cell phone line went silent forever. Oh shit. He wasn't in the middle of a struggle, and he wasn't being chased. He was simply walking home through a quiet Minnesota field, guided by the distant lights of a town he thought he recognized. But Brandon was nowhere near where he claimed to be. This is the story of a 47-minute phone call into the abyss. In the spring of 2008, the sprawling farmlands of southwestern Minnesota were quiet, vast, and unforgivingly dark at night. 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was a college student studying wind energy, a young man with his whole life stretching out ahead of him like the endless county highways he drove every day. It was May 13th, a Tuesday, and the end of the spring semester at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. Brandon had spent the evening celebrating with friends at a couple of small gatherings in the neighboring towns of Lind and Canby. By all accounts, it was a completely ordinary night. There were no arguments, no strange encounters, and no signs that anything was amiss. At around midnight, Brandon climbed into his green Chevrolet Lumina to make the 30-mile drive back home to his parents' house in Marshall. It was a route he had taken before, but instead of sticking to the well-lit State Highway 68, he opted for the rural farming backroads. It was a seemingly insignificant choice, the kind of minor decision we all make every single day. But on this particular night, taking the gravel roads would set into motion one of the most baffling and chilling unsolved mysteries in modern history. At 1:54 in the morning, the phone rang in the bedroom of Brian and Annette Swanson. It was their son, Brandon. He sounded frustrated, but relatively calm. He explained that he had misjudged a curve on a rural gravel road, and his green Chevrolet Lumina had slipped into a ditch. He wasn't hurt, not even a scratch, but the car's wheels were spinning uselessly in the dirt. He couldn't get the vehicle back onto the roadway. He needed his parents to come and pick him up. Brian and Annette, like any parents receiving a late-night call from a stranded teenager, quickly threw on some clothes and prepared to head out into the night. Brandon told his father that he knew exactly where he was. He confidently stated that he was just outside the town of Lind, a small community merely a 10-minute drive from the Swanson family home in Marshall. It should have been a quick, simple rescue mission. Brian stayed on the phone with his son as he and Annette drove out toward Lind, keeping Brandon company and coordinating their rendezvous. But as they approached the area Brandon had described, the situation began to slip into a bizarre state of confusion. Brian and Annette drove up and down the gravel roads surrounding Lind, their eyes scanning the darkness for the familiar shape of the Lumina or the glow of its taillights. They saw nothing. Brian asked Brandon to flash his car's headlights, hoping to catch a glimpse of the beams cutting through the pitch-black night. Brandon did so, and he told his father to flash his headlights in return. Brian flicked his brights on and off, but Brandon saw nothing. Neither party could see the other's lights, despite Brandon insisting that he was exactly where he said he was. The rural Minnesota night was incredibly dark, devoid of street lamps or ambient city glow, making the failure to spot the flashing headlights all the more perplexing. They were supposed to be right on top of each other. The frustration began to mount on both ends of the line. How could two cars, ostensibly in the exact same small rural area, flashing their headlights into the flat, unobstructed darkness, completely fail to see one another? The landscape out there is flat for miles. A light can be seen from incredibly far away. Yet there was nothing but an oppressive, suffocating darkness. This strange discrepancy, This impossible failure to connect, despite clear communication, was the first sign that the night was unraveling into something far more complicated than a simple car in a ditch. It was as if they were occupying two different versions of the same reality. What began as a minor inconvenience on a lonely stretch of gravel road was about to transform into a nightmare that has defied explanation for over 15 years. In this documentary, we are going to walk step by step through the agonizing 47 minutes that followed. We will retrace the exact path that Brandon Swanson believed he was taking, and we will examine the chilling realities of the landscape that eventually swallowed him whole. We are going to look closely at the deeply unsettling transcripts and accounts of that phone call, dissecting every single word spoken between a father and a son in those final, desperate moments. You will hear how a completely rational plan devolved into a terrifying unknown, and how the physical evidence left behind entirely contradicts the narrative that was unfolding over the phone. We will dive into the massive police investigation, the subsequent search efforts that utilized bloodhounds, drones, and hundreds of volunteers, and the baffling technological that only deepened the mystery of Brandon's true location. If you find yourself drawn to these cases where the ordinary suddenly turns into the impossible, consider subscribing to the channel. By joining us and turning on notifications, you help ensure these stories are never forgotten, and that we can continue to shine a light on the most haunting cold cases in history. The story of Brandon Swanson is not just a tale of a missing person. It is a profound and terrifying lesson in how easily reality can fracture, how quickly the familiar can become alien, and how a single misstep in the dark can erase a person from the face of the earth. We will explore the theories that have emerged over the years, ranging from tragic natural accidents to far more sinister possibilities that authorities have never been able to fully rule out. Because the most horrifying aspect of this case isn't just that Brandon vanished. It's the fact that we have a near-complete audio record of his final hour, a real-time documentation of a young man walking directly into an abyss. And yet, we are still no closer to finding him. The silence that followed those 47 minutes is heavy with questions that have no easy answers. Why couldn't they see each other? Why did the technology fail? And most importantly, where is Brandon? Prepare yourself as we piece together the shattered fragments of that night, because the truth of what happened in the dark fields of Minnesota is far more disturbing than any fiction. We are going to look at every angle, from the cell tower pings to the treacherous riverbeds, to understand how a 19-year-old could simply blink out of existence while talking to his father. To truly comprehend the terror of that night, you have to understand the environment of southwestern Minnesota in the dead of night. This is not the kind of darkness you experience in a suburb or even a rural neighborhood. Out on those farming back roads, away from the state highways, the darkness is absolute and total. It is a thick, heavy blackness that presses against your eyes, swallowing the beams of a flashlight within a few dozen feet. The landscape is dominated by massive, sprawling agricultural fields, primarily corn and soybeans, sectioned off by deep drainage ditches, barbed wire fences, and narrow, dusty gravel roads that intersect at rigid right angles. In May, the night air still holds a bitter, damp chill, and the wind sweeps across the flat plains with nothing to break its momentum, creating a constant, low howling sound that can mask the noise of approaching danger or drown out a cry for help. It was within this desolate, freezing environment that Brandon made a fateful decision. Frustrated by the inability to locate his parents and tired of sitting in his stranded car, he told his father Brian that he was going to leave the vehicle. He said he could see the glow of a town's lights in the distance. He believed, with absolute certainty, that those lights belonged to the town of Lind. He told his parents to stop driving around the back roads, and instead meet him at the parking lot of a popular local tavern right in the center of Lind. It was a logical, straightforward plan. He would walk toward the lights, stay on the phone with his father, and simply meet them in a well-lit, familiar public space. Brian agreed, and Brandon stepped out of the green lumina, leaving the safety of its metal shell and plunging into the cold, windy darkness. As he walked, Brandon kept up a steady stream of conversation with his father. He described his surroundings as he navigated the terrain. He mentioned that he was cutting across fields to save time, rather than sticking to the winding gravel roads. He described stepping over uneven ground, feeling the crunch of last year's crop stubble beneath his shoes. At one point, he specifically mentioned to his father that he was climbing over a fence. Later, he casually noted that he could hear the sound of running water nearby. These sensory details, the fence, the uneven field, the sound of water, were just casually mentioned during a 47-minute phone call. They seemed like mundane observations at the time, just a young man describing his cross-country hike to keep his father informed of his progress. But these specific environmental markers would soon become the most agonizing and crucial pieces of the entire puzzle. Think about the sound of that water, a small creek or a drainage ditch, and how it might sound to someone walking alone in the dark. To Brandon, it was just a landmark. To investigators, it would become a haunting that suggested he was miles away from where he thought he was. Every step he took toward those lights was a step further into a trap that neither he nor his parents could see. The confidence in his voice was a shield against the growing cold, a belief that safety was just over the next rise, just beyond the next fence line. But in the flat, deceptive terrain of Lincoln County, lights can be seen from 10 miles away, creating an illusion of proximity that has lured many travelers into exhaustion, or worse. Brandon was walking, talking, and planning his arrival, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was leading him toward a disappearance that would haunt the state of Minnesota for decades. Brandon Swanson was not a reckless teenager prone to wild behavior or disappearing acts. He was a grounded, responsible 19-year-old with a clear vision for his future. He had graduated from Marshall High School the previous year and had immediately enrolled in the Wind Energy Technology program at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. It was a demanding, forward-thinking field, and Brandon was incredibly passionate about it. He was the kind of son who, when he found himself in a minor jam, like sliding his car into a ditch, didn't hesitate to call his parents for help. He had a strong, communicative relationship with his family, particularly with his father, Brian. The fact that he stayed on the phone with his dad for 47 straight minutes while walking through the dark fields speaks volumes about their bond. He wasn't hiding anything. He was actively seeking their guidance and comfort in a stressful situation. His friends described him as loyal, quick with a joke, and incredibly dependable. He was an older brother, a beloved son, and a young man deeply rooted in his local community. The sheer normalcy of Brandon's life is what makes the events of May 14th so profoundly and deeply unsettling. This wasn't someone running away from a troubled home or entangled in dangerous criminal activities. This was a college student who simply wanted to sleep in his own bed after celebrating the end of exams. As the minutes ticked by during that long, dark walk, the conversation between Brandon and Brian remained remarkably calm. There was no panic in Brandon's voice, only the mild irritation of a long, cold walk and the persistent confusion over why they couldn't find each other earlier. Brian listened patiently to the rhythm of his son's breathing, the sound of his footsteps crunching over the rural terrain, offering words of encouragement and waiting at the designated tavern parking lot in Lind. Annette waited in the car, her anxiety slowly building as the darkness outside seemed to stretch on infinitely. They trusted that Brandon was walking toward them, guided by the lights he saw on the horizon. But as the clock approached 2:30 in the morning, the agonizing reality of the situation would soon crash down upon them. And when morning finally broke, and Annette Swanson frantically called the local police to report her son missing, she would be met not with immediate action, but with a bureaucratic wall. The authorities would casually dismiss her terror, suggesting that a 19-year-old college student had the right to be missing, perhaps just sleeping off a hangover at a friend's house. They told her it was his right to disappear if he wanted to. This initial lack of urgency, this critical loss of time in the golden hours of a disappearance, would prove to be a devastating blow to the search for Brandon. It is a frustration that would eventually lead to a change in the law itself. But on that morning, it was simply a barrier between a desperate mother and the help her son needed. The police didn't see a missing child. They saw a legal adult who might just be irresponsible. They couldn't hear the silence on the other end of the phone that Brian and Annette had been living with for hours. They didn't know about the "oh shit" that had ended the call. To them, it was just another Tuesday night gone wrong. But to the Swansons, it was the beginning of a lifetime of searching. The delay in those first few hours allowed the trail to grow cold, the winds to shift, and the mystery to settle into the soil of the Minnesota fields, where it remains buried to this day. The 47-minute mark of the phone call is where the mundane reality of a stranded motorist violently fractures into an inexplicable nightmare. It was approximately 2:30 in the morning, and the conversation between Brandon and his father had settled into a quiet, rhythmic lull. Brandon had been walking for quite some time, navigating the dark fields and wire fences, steadily moving toward the distant lights he believed belonged to the town of Lind. Brian was still on the line, listening to his son's progress and offering occasional words of encouragement. There was no heavy breathing to indicate Brandon was running, no panic in his voice to suggest he was being followed, and no indication that he felt threatened by anything in the darkness. He was just a young man walking home. And then, without any warning, without any buildup of tension or fear, Brandon suddenly yelled out. The words were sharp, sudden, and laced with absolute shock. He shouted, "Oh, shit!" It wasn't a cry of physical pain, and it wasn't a scream for help. According to his father, it sounded like the sudden, startled exclamation of someone who has just realized they are making a catastrophic mistake, or perhaps someone who has suddenly lost their footing in a terrifying way. Immediately after those two words, the phone line went completely dead. It didn't crackle or fade out, it just stopped entirely. Brian sat in the car in the tavern parking lot, the sudden silence roaring in his ears. He immediately pulled the phone away from his face, stared at the screen, and frantically hit redial. The call went straight to voicemail. He dialed again, but the result was the same. Annette, seeing the panic wash over her husband's face, began dialing Brandon's number from her own phone. Over and over again, the parents desperately tried to reconnect with their son, but the device was completely unresponsive. The sudden severing of the connection was chilling. If Brandon had simply dropped the phone, the call should have remained active. Brian would have heard the device hit the ground, heard the rustling of grass, or perhaps heard Brandon swearing as he fumbled to pick it up. If the battery had died, the phone usually emits a warning tone before shutting down, something Brian never heard. The abrupt, instantaneous death of the call suggested something far more sudden and violent. Did the phone hit water? Was it crushed? Did Brandon suffer a massive, incapacitating fall? The sheer lack of audios following that single, terrified expletive left Brian and Annette paralyzed with fear. They spent the rest of the dark, early morning hours frantically driving every gravel road, every highway, and every dirt path surrounding the town of Lind, flashing their lights, honking their horn, and screaming Brandon's name into the unforgiving wind. But the flat, black fields of Minnesota offered absolutely no response, leaving the parents alone with the echoes of those final 2 words. As the sun finally began to bleed over the vast, flat horizon of the Minnesota farmland on the morning of May 14th, a chilling realization settled over Brian and Annette Swanson. The arrival of the light did not bring comfort. Instead, it revealed the terrifying scale of the task ahead. The fields stretched out in every direction, a patchwork of dark, damp soil and jagged corn stubble that seemed to go on forever under a pale, indifferent sky. The air was sharp and biting, smelling of wet earth and the faint, metallic tang of morning frost. After hours of driving down gravel roads and shouting into the wind until their throats were raw, Annette made the agonizing decision to contact the authorities. At 6:30 in the morning, her fingers trembling and stiff from the cold, she dialed the Lind police. The air inside the precinct was heavy with the smell of stale coffee and the low rhythmic hum of cooling fans from the computer banks. When the police finally obtained the cell tower pings from Brandon's phone, they expected the data to confirm what Brian and Annette had been saying all morning, that Brandon was somewhere in the immediate vicinity of Lind. But as investigators leaned closer to the monitors, the grainy resolution of the digital map revealed a truth so jarring it caused a wave of profound confusion to wash over the room. One officer rubbed the bridge of his nose, staring in disbelief at the glowing coordinates, while the fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a clinical, cold intensity. The data was completely and utterly contradictory to the narrative established by the phone call. Brandon's phone had not been pinging off the towers near Lind at all. In fact, his calls were routing through a tower located near the town of Minneota. Armed with the new, startling cell tower data, law enforcement and the growing tide of volunteers descended upon the rural stretches surrounding Taunton and Porter. The search was no longer a blind scramble through the dark. It was now a highly targeted operation, fueled by a desperate sense of urgency. By the afternoon of May 14th, under a pale and indifferent sun, they finally made a massive breakthrough. A search helicopter, its blades thrumming a rhythmic beat over the border of Lincoln and Lyon counties, spotted a flash of green. Resting in a shallow ditch off a remote, minimum-maintenance gravel road was a vehicle. Ground units rushed to the location, their tires kicking up plumes of fine gray dust, and confirmed it was indeed Brandon's Chevrolet Lumina. Let's pause for a moment and completely re-examine that 47-minute phone call in light of this new geographical reality. When we first heard the story, we pictured Brandon walking near his hometown, navigating familiar territory, perhaps just a little confused by the dark. But now, we must overlay the audio of that call onto a completely different map. When Brandon told his father he was cutting across fields, he wasn't strolling through the benign pastures near Lind. He was blindly marching through the rugged, unfamiliar topography of Lincoln County. The air out there was likely thick with the scent of damp, thawing earth and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming frost. Every step he took was a step further into the unknown. Think back to the specific sensory details he mentioned to Brian. He talked about climbing over a fence. Investigators, following the path laid out by the search dogs, found a barbed wire fence exactly along the trajectory between the abandoned Lumina and the lights of Taunton. We can almost feel the jagged barbs snagging his clothing, and the icy chill of the metal against his palms as he hoisted himself over. He had physically scaled that barrier in the dark, his boots sinking into the soft, muddy soil on the other side as he struggled to maintain his balance. But the most terrifying detail to re-examine is his mention of hearing running water. At the time, Brandon Swanson thought nothing of it. Perhaps it was a small irrigation ditch or a trickling creek. But the search dogs were now leading investigators directly toward the Yellow Medicine River. In May of 2008, following the spring thaw and recent heavy rains, the Yellow Medicine River was not a placid, gentle stream. It was a churning, violent torrent, running high, fast, and exceptionally cold. The banks of the river in that area are notoriously steep, treacherous, and prone to crumbling into the water below under the slightest weight. When Brandon said he could hear running water, he wasn't hearing a minor obstacle. He was hearing the low, rhythmic roar of a dangerous, swollen river cutting directly across his path to the lights of Taunton. He was walking in pitch blackness, his eyes fixed on a distant glow, completely unaware of the massive, dark chasm opening up in the earth just steps ahead of him. On the other end of the line, Brian likely heard the steady, rhythmic crunch of gravel and dead grass under Brandon's feet. A sound that felt reassuring at the time, but now sounds like a grim countdown. The entire context of the phone call shifts from a frustrating inconvenience to a slow-motion tragedy. We are essentially listening to a blindfolded man walking toward a cliff. Every casual remark, every moment of silence on the line, is now imbued with a heavy, suffocating dread, because we know exactly what is waiting for him in the dark, even if he doesn't. This realization changes everything we thought we understood about those final minutes, transforming a simple phone conversation into the haunting documentation of a disaster in progress. The bloodhounds strained against their leather harnesses, their deep-chested baying replaced by a frantic, rhythmic huffing as they dragged their handlers across the uneven terrain. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the sharp metallic tang of a late spring frost that still clung to the shadows of the deep agricultural furrows. Every few yards, the handlers stumbled over frozen clods of dirt, their knuckles turning white as they gripped the leads, feeling the raw power of the dog's certainty. They were no longer just following a trail. They were retracing the final desperate steps of a boy lost in the dark. The path cut a relentless line through the fields, heading south with a terrifying sense of purpose toward the banks of the Yellow Medicine River. To truly grasp the weight of this tragedy, we must bring every fragmented piece together and detonate the reality of Brandon Swanson's final night. Let us reconstruct those agonizing last seconds of the 47-minute call. Brandon was 25 miles away from where he believed himself to be, a staggering distance born of a simple, fatal disorientation. He was exhausted, his muscles aching with a dull, persistent throb, and he was shivering uncontrollably in the damp Minnesota spring chill. His mind, clouded by fatigue, had desperately labeled the distant, flickering lights of Taunton as Lind. He had already climbed the barbed wire fence, the cold metal biting into his palms, a physical barrier that should have been a warning, but instead became a milestone in his march toward the end. He adjusted his glasses with a quick, nervous flick of his finger, a habit that persisted even in the dark. He had told his father he could hear running water, a sound that Brian likely interpreted as a minor creek, but we now know was the low, guttural roar of the Yellow Medicine River. Brandon was walking through a pitch-black agricultural field, where the scent of turned earth and decaying vegetation hung heavy in the air. His phone was pressed tight to his ear, the plastic casing feeling warm against his frozen skin, while his eyes remained locked on the horizon. He was searching for a salvation that didn't exist. He had no way of knowing that the river lay directly in his path, swollen and fast-moving from the spring thaw. The terrain along that specific section of the riverbank is notoriously treacherous. It is steep, slick with mud that clings to soles like grease, and obscured by thick, deceptive brush that masks the sudden drop-off. In the absolute, crushing darkness of the rural night, Brandon would not have seen the edge until the ground simply ceased to exist beneath his boots. He took a step, likely expecting the solid crunch of field stubble, and instead found only empty air. This is the precise moment he shouted those final words. "Oh, shit!" It was not a reaction to a person or a threat in the woods. It was the instantaneous, primal terror of a sudden, violent fall into the unknown. He plunged down the steep bank, his body crashing through the brittle, dry brush before slamming into the freezing, rushing current of the Yellow Medicine River. The phone, jolted from his grip or instantly submerged, short-circuited in a fraction of a second. This explains the abrupt, haunting silence on the line. It wasn't a deliberate hang-up. The device was destroyed the moment it hit the water. The freezing temperature would have induced an immediate cold shock response, an involuntary gasp that likely filled his lungs with icy water before he could even struggle. Weighed down by his heavy spring clothing, his black windbreaker, and his boots, he was swept away by the current in total darkness. The reason the search dogs lost his scent at the water's edge is now tragically clear. He never climbed back out. The reason his phone was never found is because it likely rests deep in the silt of the riverbed, miles from where the search began. Every bizarre anomaly of the case aligns perfectly in this one horrifying, split-second tragedy. The 47-minute call was a live broadcast of a young man walking directly into his own watery grave. The true, lingering horror of the Brandon Swanson case extends far beyond the physical mechanics of a fatal fall into cold water or a hidden crevice. It is a psychological terror that strikes at the very core of our modern sense of security. We live in an age defined by constant connection, carrying devices with glowing screens that can pinpoint our location to within a few feet and keep us tethered to the voices of those we love. We operate under a profound illusion that as long as we have a signal, we are never truly lost, and we are never truly alone. Brandon had a signal. He had a fully charged phone and was actively speaking to his father, feeling the smooth, cold plastic of the device pressed against his ear. He was doing everything right by the standards of our modern world. Yet, that technology utterly failed to save him. In fact, the illusion of safety it provided may have inadvertently sealed his fate. The phone call gave him the false confidence to leave the safety of his vehicle and strike out into the darkness, believing help was just a few fields away. It kept him distracted, his attention split between the frantic conversation with his father and the treacherous, uneven ground he was navigating. He likely felt the biting wind against his face and the rhythmic crunch of dead grass beneath his sneakers, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the digital tether of the call rather than the immediate dangers of the landscape. In the immediate aftermath of Brandon's disappearance, the Swanson family was forced to navigate a living nightmare. The air inside their home felt heavy and stagnant, filled with the scent of untouched meals and the oppressive silence of a phone that refused to ring. They had to transition from frantic searchers to grieving parents without ever having the closure of a body or a funeral. Brian and Annette Swanson refused to let their son's vanishing become just another cold case file gathering dust in a precinct. They channeled their immense grief into profound legislative action, haunted by the agonizing delay of the local police, who had initially dismissed their pleas for help because Brandon was an adult. Annette often found herself clutching the cold metal of her kitchen counter, her knuckles turning white as she replayed those first lost hours in her mind. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson forces us to confront the profound fragility of our existence. We build cities, pave roads, and create technologies that bounce our voices off satellites, all in a desperate attempt to conquer the unknown. We wrap ourselves in the belief that we have tamed the world. But the dark fields of Minnesota tell a different story. They remind us that just beyond the edge of our headlights, the raw, untamed earth still waits. It takes only a single misstep in the dark to realize how powerless we truly are against the indifferent forces of nature. Brandon's story is a haunting testament to how quickly the ordinary can shatter. A celebration with friends, a minor car accident, and a phone call to Dad. These are the mundane blocks of our lives. Yet they aligned perfectly to guide a young man off the edge of the world. We are left with a ringing silence and the reminder that sometimes the dark simply wins. If you found this journey into the unknown as unsettling as we did, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing these haunting stories to light and ensures that names like Brandon Swanson are never forgotten. As we close the book on his final night, we must ask ourselves, when we look out into the pitch-black night, what are we truly seeing? Are we seeing the safety of a distant town, or are we just projecting our own desperate hopes onto a horizon that hides a sudden, deadly drop? The answer, much like Brandon himself, remains swallowed by the dark.